For the second time, I would like to move. I would like to move that we adopt the executive subcommittee recommendation of approving James Nobles to be the legislative auditor for a 6-year term ending November 17th, 2025.
Is there any discussion? Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to make some comments. I don't know that it's a discussion, but I simply want to explain my vote because, as people may know, I intend to vote no on the reappointment. And so I just want to lay out a few comments about why I intend to vote that way. First of all, I want people to know, who may be watching, who may not understand, that as a part-time legislature, that we have a rather limited ability to investigate executive agencies and make sure they're functioning the way the public expects. And the way we accomplish that is through the OLA, the Office of the Legislative Auditor. The Office of the Legislative Auditor is the biggest tool in our toolbox for making sure that we have a well-functioning, nonpartisan, that's the biggest tool in our toolbox. And it is important to have a well-functioning, nonpartisan, and independent OLA, and that is critical to the functioning of our government. I think we all understand that and agree with that. Very recently, we've had a lot of information coming to light about management issues and financial dysfunction in state agencies, and the information is that some of this dysfunction has been happening for decades. As has been noted, Mr. Nobles has been the legislative auditor for 36 years. And one of my concerns is that if there are deep and systemic and long-term problems at state agencies, one has to ask how these have been missed and allowed to go on for so long. And as I noted, the only tool that we really have to ferret that out is the Legislative Auditor's Office. At the meeting of the Personnel Committee, I noted this concern, and I also noted another concern, and that is that Mr. Nobles at times exaggerates audit findings seemingly in pursuit of headlines. After that meeting, I did some research on the standards that govern the work of auditors and evaluators, and I found the 2018 U.S. General Accounting Office Government Auditing Standards, which really lay out how auditors are supposed to proceed. And those standards say that they lay out the foundation for government auditors to lead by example in the areas of independence, transparency, accountability, and quality through the audit process. So turning to the idea of independence, which is something we've been discussing here and is one of the descriptors, of course, that's often associated with Mr. Nobles and his office. The GAO standards that I mentioned lay out some of the possible threats to an auditor's independence, and these include threats such as self-interest and familiarity. And I'd like to discuss these just for a moment. Self-interest threat is the threat that a financial or other interest will inappropriately influence an auditor's judgment or behavior. As I've mentioned now on several occasions, I'm concerned that the auditor's interest in the use of publicity to promote the visibility of the office of the auditor and the auditor himself is interfering with that independence. I do not agree that publicity is needed to generate policymakers' interest in a report. There are many reports that are issued that do not reach the level of the newspaper that we take very seriously on this commission and, of course, in our respective committees in the legislature. Influence coming from a report should be done, as the GAO standards state, through the persuasive use of evidence and facts. And I do believe that Mr. Nobles' interest in publicity poses a threat to his objectivity. Another thing that concerns me is what they call the familiarity threat, and that is a threat that aspects of a relationship with management or personnel of an audited entity, such as a close or long relationship, will lead an auditor to take a position that is not objective. After 36 years of auditing Minnesota state agencies, I don't know, but I wonder whether Mr. Nobles may have too much familiarity which may sometimes cause him to focus on the wrong things or perhaps miss systemic issues, as we have recently seen. I believe a fresh look is needed. The GAO accounting standards are very explicit about the needs of objectivity and that the presentation of findings should be balanced in content as well as tone. The standards explicitly state that examiners should refrain from using adjectives and adverbs to characterize evidence and findings. The report says that presentation should be balanced in content and tone, and that a report's credibility is enhanced, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's enhanced when it presents evidence in an unbiased manner and in the proper context. So balanced tone, refraining from using adjectives or adverbs. This same point is made in another resource that I found, which is the 3rd edition of the Program Evaluation Standards, which is a standard practice for program evaluation nationally and internationally. And they say this: reporting procedures should guard against distortion caused by personal feelings and biases, so that the evaluation report fairly reflects the evaluation findings. So what am I talking about here? I'm certainly not talking about circumstances where Mr. Nobles points out that there is dysfunction in an agency. Indeed, that's what we ask him to do. I'm talking about the way those findings are often presented, or recently I've noted that they've been presented with statements such as, "we believe," when there is no evidence for something, or "we could not substantiate, but others are concerned about something," or "we were surprised by a response," or "a strong and disturbing picture is presented." In a recent report, when discussing DHS's communications with the White Earth and Leech Lake tribes, the auditor's report stated that the communications from DHS were not timely or respectful. Perhaps I was not aware that whether agencies were respectful was part of the auditor's concern. He says things like, "we were surprised and troubled to learn." I believe that these kinds of statements reflect a lack of objectivity, a lack of independence, that they go beyond what we need as a legislature to have confidence in a report. We don't ask for personal opinions, we ask for analysis, data, and analysis of that data and recommendations based on that data. Mr. Nobles has stated that he believes that he needs to do this in order to get the report of the legislature. But the GAO report says this: being convincing means that the audit results are responsive to the audit objectives, that the findings are presented persuasively, and that the conclusions and recommendations flow logically from the facts presented. The validity of the findings, the reasonableness of the conclusions, and the benefit of implementing the recommendations are more convincing when supported by sufficient appropriate evidence. Reports designed in this way can help focus the attention of responsible officials on the matters that warrant attention and can provide an incentive for taking corrective action. So, in conclusion, I want to be very clear. I personally have lost confidence in Mr. Nobles' ability to serve in this office at the level that the citizens of Minnesota need and deserve. I do not believe that after 36 years in the job, he should be appointed for another 6-year term. Therefore, I am casting a no vote on the reappointment.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. And frankly, in this committee and other committees, we have a broad spectrum of communication. And I've never seen anything from the auditor's office that isn't well within, the middle, not extreme on either end. I've been on the receiving end. I've been an officer of a school district, of a special education district, where we've been audited by different entities. I've been involved with large corporations that were audited, and I've also been part of an audit team. And there, you can boil it down to very bland reports, but there's always information that's in those margins that is very good for us as oversight to have a better feeling and some flavoring. I mean, there are I've been informed many times there are multiple shades of each color. And sometimes it's important to see, you know, some of those gradations. And I think not being able to use adjectives and other things that make it more illustrative of what happened. Because frankly, in an audit, you can be very cooperative and fail the audit, or you could pass the audit and not be very cooperative. And when you're auditing, if you're not having that cooperation, you wonder, is there something that, you know, you missed, or is there something that they're hiding, et cetera? Well, frankly, I enjoy a conversation that we have, and in many years with the auditors. And I think as most of us, I have had them come and do a private discussion about an audit because you can, I guess, be a little bit more direct and that way find things out that aren't in the bland, whitewash, you know, public type discussion. And you can ask questions that are not, how should we say, I don't know what the answer is, so I'm not sure, you know, what's coming out. So when they publicly say they have concerns beyond, I fully understand that you can have concerns that aren't a failure of the audit, but concerns and practices that open up to future possibilities of things falling through the cracks. I mean, every year we've got where we've discovered rules weren't followed, or, gee, we didn't have rules to prevent something. And so while I can understand some people not liking on this or that audit certain adjectives and descriptives, I find nothing that would cause me to say that the behavior hasn't been well within the norm of activity that we see here in the legislature. In fact, we probably see some stuff on the extremes that hits the press more. Thank you.
And I'm going to have commission members comment or question before I go to Mr. Nobles, because I want to have the entirety of the comment period. So Senator Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, I don't look at the reports as being publicity seeking, and certainly not to the point where any adulation would impact Mr. Nobles' ability to fairly conduct an audit. I find the audits well supported by evidence, well supported by the facts that are documented and externally verified. I've been told no on program evaluations because he said it appears to show favoritism. He talked the last time we met about he doesn't do bumper stickers. He's not going to vote in the next election so that or not in the primary, so that there's no question that he is about the function of the Office of the Legislative Auditor. There have been times I've been disappointed that the reports didn't go further because I either hoped or thought that there was more there. I have not heard in the number of evaluation hearings that I've been in this question of publicity seeking or over-familiarity with an agency. I don't believe Mr. Nobles has an adversarial relationship with agencies, but one of accountability. and an expectation that he will be treated professionally when he goes into an agency. And I think that is reflected as you talk to commissioners. They might not like the audit, but they understand that they were respected through the audit process. And so given that I hadn't, in numerous public settings, hadn't heard these questions raised earlier, I certainly cannot support them, and I will be supporting Mr. Nobles for his reappointment. And I find him to be independent and trustworthy, and to take his role so seriously so that we as legislators can continue to trust him. Happy to support his reappointment.
Senator Klein.
Mr. Chair, I too am enthusiastically going to support the motion and vote to reappoint. And with specific regards to the question of publicity seeking, I think we have a policy in the legislature not to attribute motives to behavior, and certainly none of us knows what is in the heart of the auditor, and we cannot ascertain whether he has an appetite for publicity or not. So I would wish that had not been spoken into the record. I would say, though, I want to thank Representative Liebling for the specific examples about some subjective impressions that are in the reports. These are excellent reports, extremely well written, very readable. In my short time here in the legislature, they have taught me a great deal that I did not know about government. But the precise examples like disrespectful behavior from the department or subjective impressions of certain events, I think are important to be excluded. I think I would rather receive raw data and make decisions about the adjectives myself as a legislator, whether DHS was disrespectful or not. I just think that would be a better process. And it strikes me also, Mr. Chair, that the review, the annual review process that we have just passed might have been a way to change this behavior. If the reports weren't precisely what we were hoping to see, and yet we thought in general we had a very competent auditor, this would have been a way to give feedback and maybe change the process before it had to come to a split vote on reappointment. So, thank you.
Senator Friend.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a yes vote. I want to start by saying there's two groups of people that benefit from the work that's been done by the Legislative Auditor's Office. First of all, the people of Minnesota. How many of us have talked to constituents who have concerns about spending or about inefficiency or about ways to do things better, and we've informed them about the existence of the Office of the Legislative Auditor, and many times in my experience they've said, oh, I didn't know that, that's interesting. You can follow that up by pointing out that past reports are available online, and while I have not been here 30 years, my experience is that these reports are outstanding and provide just what this commission needs, which is information upon which we must base our decisions. That's the first group. The second group, I think, is almost more important, which is that the presence of an effective, highly skilled Office of Legislative Auditor sends a message to everybody that might be audited and creates an environment of transparency, that we promote efficiency, that we reward impartiality. And so I'd ask the people in this room, how many problems have been prevented, not because the legislative auditor did a great report, you do, but by the thought that it might be a report preventing someone who's serving our state from making a mistake or failing to cross their T's and dot their I's. Representative Liebling, I firmly agree with questions about familiarity and adjectives. My take on that is those are very good points to make in general. I simply don't find evidence of those enough to support me voting no at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I've certainly affirmed my vote that I'll be voting yes. Some of the comments that were made, in my time and my understanding of the government, when we're looking for and to impugn the great work that the legislative auditor has done, decades of failure within any particular agency in a responsibility oversight role, which really is not your role. And it's not your function to do program audit except on the occasion where we have special audits. And so the things that have been highlighted in the work that I think catches the headlines, we spoke about this, Representative Liebling, and I have a proposal we can work on to help vet out some of those things. I've seen nothing but, the highest level of respect and trust of you and all of your staff. I look on the other side, and I actually think you give the benefit of the doubt to the agencies in every way, shape, and form you can in every report I've seen. And sometimes, to my dismay, that maybe that should be harsher. I think the issues that came up in our subcommittee report about adjectives and statements that were concerning were actually quotes that you've received from staff in the work that you've done, and you were just conveying those things. They are dramatic, but when you look at the level of issues that have come forth and that they've highlighted or that they've discovered, they do an awesome job. And again, at the most respectful level that I've seen. The reliance, on the OLA, one, to find programs that are not within their purview, and I think on the other side, we have a tremendous amount of reliance that the agencies have on the OLA for legislative recommendations. It's not the OLA's job to tell those agencies what their job is. And so we have a heavy reliance on them in every way, shape, and form, and it's just not what they're designed to do. And so with that, Mr. Nobles and staff, I fully recommend we vote for their approval. And thank you for your service.
Senator Rest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members, and Mr. Nobles. I, in particular, am very proud to serve on this commission and with all of you, even in those instances in which we disagree on something going forward, like the evaluation scheme, if you will. The kind of conversation that we have on this commission, I do believe, is extraordinary. It is absolutely extraordinary. We are comfortable with agreeing, we are comfortable with disagreeing, and I don't believe any of us, in my evaluation, takes it seriously, or personally. I don't take it seriously, but not personally. I have seen Mr. Nobles over the years go through some very, very difficult relationships with executive agencies. The Legislative Audit Commission has responded to that when a legislator every once in a while thinks that they should dictate what goes into a report, or who gets evaluated or judged or investigated. And the Legislative Auditor's Office has resisted that kind of interference. So I'm proud to cast a yes vote, and I appreciate the words of Representative Quam, thank you, and Senator Coran, Senator Klein, and Senator Frentz, and all the rest of you, whether you are speaking today or not. I welcome when we have criticism. I think we can deal with that. We don't run from it. We answer it. And I will obviously, or at least obviously me, I'll be voting yes.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And of course, I will support this nomination as well of Mr. Nobles to continue. I also served as chair of this commission some years ago and had some very direct conversations with Mr. Nobles and appreciated our back and forth and my suggestion for a direction as well as his. But I want to remind us that we as legislators or the public set the objectives for every audit. We set those objectives. We sit down with the auditors after they have questioned us about what direction, especially if the topic came from us, should we take on this? What questions do you want asked? What is relevant to this audit that will make a difference in the outcome of the overall audit? And so we have to take responsibility for whatever is the result, because we set the objective, or the public, and I have many public who have asked for various audits and have directed them to Mr. Nobles or to Ms. Randall, with whom I have many conversations frequently. And then in the end, it is the legislators who determine whether or not to take up a recommendation. And I know over the years, many of them have been ignored. So, to what extent we're valuing all of this hard work, I think it should be questioned, because many of these recommendations have been ignored. And maybe for a good reason, but in many instances because we're probably too reluctant to take them on. And finally, with the dissent of Representative Liebling, I think it's important that we do know that when our chief, Mr. Nobles, meets with agency heads, that if disrespect is shown, we need to know that. And I have no problem with his reporting that. If a question is asked by the media, that is his answer, because we need to know that, because they all work for the people of Minnesota. So with all of that said, I think that we should reconsider, first of all, this adoption of the subcommittee's report on annual evaluation. As Senator Kiffmeyer pointed out, lines 19 through 27 are far too vague, and I think in light of what Representative Liebling said, we have not fulfilled that obligation of following certain principles, which is the opening line on line 20 on page 1. So I hope that we will reconsider this document that we did adopt, for which I voted no, and that we continue to support Mr. Nobles and find some other way that is more specific for evaluating his performance as well as the performance of the deputies, and then directing him and Ms. Randall and Mr. Buse in how they evaluate their staff. Thank you.
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Mr. Nobles and your staff have done an admirable job, and their independence from the legislature is what gives it such great value. My concern is that we continue that. It's not broken. Matter of fact, it's functioning very well. And I think to recognize that, it'd be very careful for us to start putting our fingers into that, and we can have consequences, not intended maybe, but it's very, very important. And its value to us on these things, on the reports and things, is because of that, almost in spite of us, you might say. And so I have my concerns about that and will continue working in that area. But in supporting Mr. Nobles today, I think especially when it comes to media sometimes, because it gets reported in the news doesn't mean anybody saw it, least of all Mr. Nobles or his staff. But sometimes the report itself generates media. My gosh. It's the result of the report, not because of an action, but he is the head of the OLA. So yes, of course, in speaking for the commission, the report and those things, of course, the press, but they make those choices, and it's for them as well. And I think it's really important because we don't sometimes like the message, we don't go after the messenger, and especially here for us as Audit Commission members, how important it is for us to keep that in mind and to deal with those facts as they come about to us. Probably one of the things that I've been most appreciative of in over these years of being on the Audit Commission is constantly hearing from those that have been audited. I was treated with respect. I was treated with courtesy. The auditor was thorough. The auditor was fair. The facts are what they are. And so I think it's important. I mean, that is of incredible value to us to be able to have that, but especially coming from those he has audited. And I think nobody would come and seek an audit if they thought it wasn't going to be fair, honest, respectful, and transparent, as we heard today. That in of itself is probably one of the greatest recommendations you could have. Please come and audit me. You don't do that to someone you don't have confidence in, that they're going to treat you with respect, be fair and honorable in regards to that. That's of incredible value to us. And part of that, and large part of it, is due to the leadership of Mr. Nobles. You can't just kind of separate all that out. So I really want to support his reappointment, and I'm very grateful that he's even willing to take this on for another 6 years. Because I will tell you, folks, if you go out there and do a search sometime in the future, you'll be hard-pressed to find somebody that meets those levels of qualifications. So probably one of the most challenging environments you can think of, walking the line between legislative, judicial, and the executive branch, and yet have high marks coming from each one of them, especially in regards to the work of those audits. So I will be glad to be voting yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other members? I have a couple comments about 6 years, the next 6 years, and I'm going to focus on something I think you've heard me say before, and that is I'm concerned about the increase in the number of special reviews. I'm concerned about the existing framework and the budgeting that we need to look at in the future. And you heard me ask at the subcommittee of whether there should be a third division just to deal with the special reviews. If we're up to 240 special reviews, do we need to have a budget? Do we need to make a correction? And it's not really even correction's not the right word. Maybe it's an evolution to have a way of dealing with the special reviews as they keep coming and as we have the budget that we have. So that's my concern over the next 6 years is how do we deal with the budgeting, the management of the office, the preparation, getting policies adapted into standard operating procedures. I think also, and I want to be clear for the public, I'm not going to have public testimony today, but consistently we have Mr. Heller coming to ask concerns about accessibility. And I would like it to be at some point where we have resolved his concerns so that he doesn't feel the need to continue to come and express them, that we're not quite there yet. So I would ask that the auditor continue to work and try to resolve some of these. Some may not be resolvable, I understand that, but I would like to have you work on that. So with that, Mr. Nobles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Legislative Audit Commission. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. I appreciate you considering my request for a reappointment. I feel very honored and grateful that I've been able to hold this position for as many years as I have. I do believe that the Office of the Legislative Auditor and this Audit Commission is a very important asset to this state, and I feel extremely grateful for those who came before most of you who decided that this office should be created and this commission should be created. And so I think we are all here benefiting from the work of many other legislators over many years. And I have to say, the staff that has been within the Office of the Legislative Auditor for so many years that produce this good work. Let me just comment very briefly, and I know time is fleeting. We will work on every concern that Mr. Heller has, we have, and we will try to continue to resolve his concerns. Let me address the issue of publicity. This is not the first time that I've been called out. Actually, many years ago, a chair of the Legislative Audit Commission said, you know, you issue these reports. It was not Senator Rest. None of you were, none of you were the chair at that time. But a chair came to me and said, you know, you do all this work and nobody really pays attention. And what legislators really pay attention to is what's in the paper or what's on TV. And so let's go over to the press conference room in the State Office building with the chair and the legislative auditor whenever you issue a report, gather them all together, and then it will get more impact for the work you do. And I said, okay. And we did it once. And I was on TV. And the majority leader then, Roger Moe, called me into his office. And he said, what are you doing? What are you running for, Jim? And I said, Senator, I'm not running for anything. And he said, well, only people who go over into the State Office building and hold press conferences are running for something. So I never held another one. But when the media would call and want to quote or want to come and film me in my office, I would say yes. And I think that over the years, I have admittedly become probably more visible as a legislative staffer, which I still consider myself to be. I certainly didn't gain that visibility working at House Research. It just wasn't part of the job. But the media does come to me and ask for my opinions. I often get quoted. I will promise you, given the concern, that I will lower my profile. And when we are requested to comment on an audit, Mr. Buse will make a comment. He's the deputy and quite qualified to do that. And when an evaluation is released and the media wants some additional comment, you know, first of all, what we always say to the media when they want to quote, read the report. Quote the report. We spent months and months and months working on the report. Don't ask me to say something off the top of my head. Use the report. But no, they want to quote. And so when it's wanting something more from an evaluation, Ms. Randall will do that. And when it's a special review, Mr. Alter will do that. So hopefully you won't see me nearly as much in the media, and we will put that issue to rest. I am quite willing to lower my public profile, but I do think somebody, and the deputies and Mr. Alter can certainly do that just as well or better than I, somebody often needs to speak to the media from our office to explain a finding or expand on it. And I might remind you that many of the quotes are picked up when we are making presentations to legislative committees, not holding press conferences, but we are presenting material to you. And the cameras are there, and they pick up whatever they want. And so, again, they make that choice, we don't. And I still may be before you from time to time presenting a report and can't avoid being on TV or in the news. Just tell you another story. I was coming home one night, and one of the neighbors came out and said, Jim, Billy wants to say something to you. Little 6-year-old boy, and he said, Mr. Nobles, I saw you on TV. And I said, Billy, yes, sometimes Mr. Nobles gets into trouble. His mother had to explain that. Let me mention just a couple of other things. And then I do want Mr. Buse to talk about one of the issues that was raised. Yes, I become a passionate advocate for accountability. And when I see state government failing to deliver on MNSure, on MNLARS, on many of the things that we've put millions of dollars into, and they don't serve the public well, I say so. And if you want to say those are beyond the bounds of an auditor, I will accept that, and I will again rely on my colleagues to comment. But do I carry around, after 36 years, some degree of frustration that state government has not always delivered what we have promised to the taxpayers? Yes. Is that a bias? Call it if you will. I consider it my job. We have made comments. I have written comments, and Senator Klein, you specifically mentioned the comment that was in one of our reports about being disrespectful to the American Indian population. If I were to rewrite that, and I appreciate your suggestion, what I would rewrite is that the department, the commissioner, the governor, the lieutenant governor considered the department's communication with the American Indian tribes disrespectful, because that's what they have said publicly. And the tribes told me they felt they had been disrespected. So I adopted that. I felt it was well-founded. I thought there were facts supporting that feeling on the part of the department and the American Indian community for that to become a statement I felt comfortable making. But it is a judgment. It's a subjective judgment on my part. And I certainly take to heart some of the things that have been said and will be more cautious about those kinds of statements. On the issue of the fact that I've been 36 years as legislative auditor, and there have been problems uncovered in state government that I didn't previously find, because we have conducted a lot of audits over the years, and it's not perfect yet. So after 36 years of doing a lot of auditing, there are still problems in state government and still things that emerge. So Mr. Buse is now deputy for the Financial Audit Division, but there have been previous deputies and many staff who've conducted audits of state agencies. And yet, when we do special reviews or evaluations or even additional audits, we find problems, even systemic problems, that weren't there maybe when we were there, or they were there and we didn't find them. So I'd like him to speak to that issue if that's appropriate, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Buse.
Mr. Chair, committee members, I'd like to thank you for this. My name is Chris Buse. I'm the Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Financial Audit Division. I'd like to say thanks for the opportunity to testify today. But the issue that Representative Liebling brought up about, missing things within agencies and this expectation gap, this is one that's just particularly painful for me. And if it bothers you, it bothers me 1,000 times worse. I can tell you that. And that's an issue that I want to work with the full commission on, and in particular, it's an issue I want to work with my audit subcommittee chair on. Because when you look at the breakdown of our work and our 36 staff that we have today, one of the challenges that we're facing is that about 2/3 of our work is required work in state law. We do the state's financial statement audit. The state's financial statements are massive. We look at pensions and investments and bridges and roads and hundreds of funds. And the problem that we're facing is that the rules and the complexity get more every year. When I started in the Legislative Auditor's Office, there were only fund accounts for the government. Now the government has fund statements, but it also puts together entity-wide financial statements, just like a private business. And new things come every year. We're having new requirements now with special new provisions on accounting for leases. It never ends. So we have this unduly complex entity that we have to do this financial statement on, work on. We also have a monumental task doing the state government's single audit. But even within that single audit of the federal programs, I just think there's some elephants in the room that nobody likes to talk about. For example, we have over 400 federal programs in the state of Minnesota. The federal single audit, I think, audits about 12 of them. So the vast majority of federal programs don't get any coverage because this federal single audit prescribes exactly what we need to look at. They tell you how the program selection process has to work. And then within the federal single audit, when you go down into the weeds, it's very prescriptive of the areas you have to look at. So the things that are probably most important to a lot of us, like eligibility for programs, it gets covered at a high level, but then you're looking at areas like federal reports and testing those, and the federal government has a lot of work that we do on looking at their cash management and cash flow. So the expectation gap is we have 2/3 of our work that is required audit work that gets more onerous all the time. And then we have that 1/3 of the work. And one of my goals, if you read in the document that I put out, is to be more policymaker focused and have you more involved in that decision process. What are we going to look at? What aren't we going to look at? And this year, we have 10 discretionary projects on our docket. But our managers, we have a list that we continuously maintain. We look at it every 2 weeks on what are all the topics on the list. Every one of those constitutional officers is on that list. And there's lots of other entities that never get any other coverage. And there's lots of subsets of programs that don't get coverage. So the challenge that we're going to face is that how do we work together as a team, me as the leader of the entity and you as the Audit Commission, to figure out how do we meet that expectation gap. And I'm open to hear suggestions. Do we need to have conversations about not doing those required financial statement audits anymore and focusing on internal control and compliance audits, which are probably the things that you want to hear about more. I'm open to hear any suggestions, but today there is a gap that exists. I know the gap, you know the gap, but the reality is there's a lot of government that just doesn't get covered by the Legislative Auditor's Office, and we collectively have to come to grips with that as a team of the Auditor's Office and the Audit Commission.
Senator Cran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I renew my motion appointing James Nobles to be the legislative auditor for a 6-year term ending November 17th, 2025.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. No. Ayes have it. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would now ask that you confirm my appointment of Chris Buse as Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Financial Audit Division to serve a term coterminous with mine. I think you know Mr. Buse well. I've known him for decades. He is a true public servant and leader, and I feel very grateful to have him available to lead the Financial Audit Division.
Senator Cran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move approving the legislative auditor's appointment of Christopher Buse to the Deputy Legislative Auditor for Financial Audit Division for a term ending November 17th, 2025.
Is there any discussion? Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to say that one of the things that I think that Mr. Nobles has done very well is to hire Mr. Buse and Ms. Randall. And I'm, just to be clear that my comments in no way should reflect on my view of the staff of the agency, because I do believe that we have extremely fine staff. And notwithstanding my comments about an appointment for a further 6-year term, for Mr. Nobles, I do support the reappointment of these two fine people. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Senator Cran.
I renew my motion approving the legislative auditor's appointment of Christopher Buse to the Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Financial Audit Division for a term ending November 17th, 2025.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Ayes have it. Congratulations, Mr. Buse.
And so now, Mr. Chairman, I would request that you confirm my appointment of Judy Randall to be Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Program Evaluation Division. Judy came to work at OLA back in 1998. She has worked her way up through many evaluations, being a manager. She is an absolutely wonderful, deep researcher, rigorous, tough, and she has extremely high standards for the work that the division does. And I am, again, very grateful that I have the opportunity to have such a person to be the deputy for the Program Evaluation Division.
Senator Cran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move appointing the legislative auditor's appointment of Judy Randall to be Deputy Legislative Auditor for the Program Evaluation Division for a term ending November 17th, 2025.
Is there any discussion? Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Ayes have it. Congratulations, Ms. Randall.